In this video, I'm going to break down everything you need to know about how gas, power, and water and sewer utilities work for investment properties in the Cleveland market. What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cleveland Investor Primer channel. My name is Rob, and I'm here to share with you all the stuff I learned over the course of the years investing in Cleveland area real estate. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and tapping the bell icon so you can be notified every time I publish a new video. And also, of course, likes are appreciated. It's super helpful for the YouTube algorithm. So if you could just tap that button down below, it's super easy. It'll take like half a second. Much appreciated. I'm making this video because a very common concern amongst investors, particularly newbies to the Cleveland market, is that they're wondering how utility accounts work and if they're going to be stuck footing the bill for some of these or all of these types of things. And this video will get to the bottom of that and really give you the information that you need to know so that you can make an informed decision about investing. Just a warning up front, this is probably not the most riveting video out there on the topic of real estate investing, but it is extremely technical and will provide useful information that is going to be directly relevant to Cleveland area investors. I will be breaking down each of the types of utilities, starting with gas, then moving on to electric, and then moving on to water and sewer, and giving you a few watch outs along the way so that you'll come away from this video knowing everything that you need to know from an investor standpoint on how these utilities work from a rental property perspective. Starting off first with gas accounts in the Cleveland market, it's important to know for those particularly who are viewing this from California that the gas company, the gas provider, is totally separate from the electricity provider. It's not at all like PG&E where there's just sort of a one-stop shopping type of thing when you set up an account. In the Cleveland market, like most markets in the Midwest and East Coast, there are separate companies that are going to be providing each of those. So gas is going to be provided by Dominion in the Cleveland area. And gas is an extremely important utility in the Cleveland market because the vast majority of properties there are heated by gas, and in Cleveland, it gets pretty cold in the winter. Pretty much 100% of the time, each single family house in the Cleveland area is going to have its own gas meter. So the tenants will just have their own gas account in their own name, and the landlord has no responsibility for that as long as the tenants are there living in the house. For multi-unit properties, the majority of the time, each of the units will have its own separate gas meter, and each of those tenants will, of course, have that gas account in their own name and pay that themselves, so the landlord has no responsibility for that. However, there are occasionally multifamily properties where the heat source is shared. There may be a single heat source that is providing heat via a boiler or a large furnace, or potentially shared hot water that the landlord is going to be on the hook for. This is particularly true with some of the older houses that maybe were chopped up over the years. They may have been in more urban neighborhoods, and they were started off as a single family house, and at some point in time somebody converted it into a triplex or something like that with multiple units. It's not at all uncommon to encounter those where there is still just a single boiler, or there is just a single furnace, or maybe even a single water heater, and the landlord is going to be on the hook to pay for that gas bill in those cases. One important thing to keep in mind is that for properties, even where the gas account will typically be paid for by the tenant because they have their own gas meter, when you have a period of vacancy, it is going to be on you as the property owner to have the gas account in your own name and pay for that bill, which in the spring and summer months is probably not going to be too bad, but in the winter months, basically December, January, February, and into March, that is going to probably be pretty costly. So it's important to factor that into your calculations when you think about the potential costs associated with owning a property in the Cleveland market. With gas accounts, the big takeaway is that before buying a property, it's probably a good idea to figure out what the heat source is and figure out if those meters are separate for each individual unit in the case of multifamilies, or if that's something that you'll have to be on the hook for, because that will majorly impact your investment return if you have to pay the gas bill on that property. So due diligence on that front is definitely going to be important. Next up is electricity. Just like gas, the vast majority of individual units within a multifamily property are going to have their own meter, and that account will go in the tenant's name directly. With single family houses, it's pretty much 100% of the cases that the tenants will just have that account in their own name. It'll be their own meter. The few cases where the landlord may have to have an account in their own name is cases where in a multifamily property, there's like what is called a house meter, and that may provide lights for sort of common areas. This is particularly the case if you've got a larger building, like maybe a four-suiter, a quad, where there's common area, like sort of a hallway that may have lights. There may be coin laundry. Very, very uncommon in like a duplex, unless similar to gas, if it was chopped up. It was originally a single family house and turned into a duplex at some point in time, you may encounter that, but it's typically going to be the case that each individual unit will have its own meter, and that tenant will have their own account upon move-in. So that's another cost that is not going to be borne by the landlord in the majority of cases. And it's also important to know that there actually are a couple different power companies within the Cleveland area. The predominant one is the Illuminating Company, which is now owned by First Energy. But there is also a local power company called Cleveland Public Power that services quite a bit of the city of Cleveland proper. Just like with gas, it's important for investors to just take a quick look at any multifamily property that they're buying and make sure that it does have separate meters for each of the units, and understand if there is actually a house meter that they would be responsible for. And just like with gas, the landlord would be on the hook to pay for that bill during any period of vacancy. But fortunately, electricity is not going to be terribly expensive for a vacant unit at pretty much any time of year. And finally, saving the hottest utility topic for last, if there is such a thing as the hottest utility topic, is water and sewer. And that's one of the topics that gets a lot of attention actually on forums like BiggerPockets and other online Facebook groups and things like that, where there are investors that are just wanting to learn about how things work in the Cleveland market. Water and sewer comes up again and again and again. It's probably the most nuanced utility topic, and in a lot of cases, it's actually the most expensive. The thing that's most important to understand about water and sewer costs, unlike any of the other utility costs, is that they are actually lienable to the property, which is to say that if there's usage incurred and those costs are not paid for, that can potentially be attached to the property, usually via property tax. It just kind of gets added onto the property tax bill, and there's no getting away from paying that. One way or another, they will get their money. And for this reason, my golden rule is that landlords should always keep the water and sewer accounts in their own name and ensure that those bills get paid. That's not to say that it's impossible to offload those costs to the tenants in quite a few cases, but the landlord needs to be the one that's actually responsible for making sure that that bill does get paid every month, so that it doesn't end up in a situation where that gets tacked onto the tax bill, along with, of course, extra fees and delinquency, shut-off notices, and costs associated with all that. For single-family properties, it's not at all uncommon for landlords to just bill back to the tenants for the actual use incurred for water and for sewer. Though there are some property managers who are dead set against this practice, the majority of property managers in the Cleveland market are pretty on board with billing back to tenants for single-family properties. It really just becomes a matter of invoicing the tenants each month for their actual use when those bills come in. Sometimes there may be a copy of the bill that's provided to the tenant to sort of indicate as proof that they used the amount that they're being charged for. And it will nearly always work out just fine for properties that are in that C class or better range. It may not work out quite so well for properties that are in the lower end of the spectrum, particularly if properties are occupied by subsidy tenants, so tenants that are receiving what's called Eden or Section 8. Those are cases where bill back to tenants might not work so well, might not be feasible. But for the majority of properties that are kind of more in that middle class or higher realm, it's usually not a problem at all to bill back to tenants. For multifamily properties, on the other hand, it's a totally different story. When dealing with 2 or more units at a single property, it is most commonly the case that there is not a separate meter for each of those units. There is just a single meter for that whole property, and the landlord is going to be the one footing that bill for the water and sewer costs for those multi-unit properties the vast majority of the time. Occasionally, you'll find a post-World War II multifamily that's set up with separate meters for each individual unit. Most common if it's set up as townhouse type units as opposed to flats, different levels on different floors. And in those cases where there is truly a separate meter and a separate account for each of those units, you can absolutely bill back to tenants. Again, depending on the area, if you're dealing with the lower tier of the spectrum, you may not have such good luck with that, particularly, again, if you're dealing with subsidy tenants. But as long as you're in a C plus or a better area and you're dealing with cash paying tenants, just structure your lease accordingly. You can have those tenants be responsible for the costs that they're incurring for water and sewer usage. Sometimes investors will ask if it's practical to actually split out the water usage for a multifamily, either having sub-meters installed or billing back to the tenants sort of proportionally. So if it's a triplex, billing back the tenants for a third of the water usage. If it's a duplex, billing back the tenants for half of the water usage for that given period. I would say that neither of those is typically going to make any sense. In most cases, replumbing the property to do that sub-metering is way more costly than it will actually ever be worth. And it's something that I just would never pursue personally, and I wouldn't advise others to pursue. And then billing back just proportionally. So if you've got a duplex and your bill came out to $150, building each of those two units 75, that's just a nightmare waiting to happen, because there's going to be an endless parade of bickering, and the tenant in the first unit is going to say that the tenant in the second unit is running water way more and they shouldn't be on the hook for it. It's just going to be way more drama than anybody wants to deal with. I don't know of any property managers who would even support that. The only way you may be able to pull that off is if you were managing the property yourself, but again, highly inadvisable. Your best bet to manage water costs in a multifamily property where you're on the hook for paying that bill is really to make sure that you've got the best water saving fixtures you can get in there. So shower heads and toilets and faucets with aerators, all sorts of things that are going to be using a lot less water. Particularly if it's an older property, it may still have one of those toilets that's using several gallons per flush, which of course is going to be really wasteful over the course of months and years. I'm also of the opinion that good rapport with the tenants and just encouraging them to be mindful of their water usage could actually help you cut down on your bills as well. Another thing to keep in mind for water and sewer is that the majority of the jurisdictions within the Cleveland market, within Cuyahoga County, are going to have two separate bills. One's going to come from the Cleveland Water Department, Cleveland Division of Water, and one is going to come from NEORSD, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. And those bills are going to come separately each month, and they're going to be based on just the single water meter usage though, but they're billed separately as separate accounts. There are a few suburbs that do things a bit differently. So Bedford, for instance, Bedford has its own utility department where a combined water sewer bill will be provided each month. Euclid, on the other hand, they bill their sewer through the water bill, so it'll still be a Cleveland water bill, but there will be no separate sewer bill that will come. It just varies from city to city for the suburbs. So when you're first setting up those accounts, just making sure that you either talk to somebody who does know how those accounts are set up. Any property manager within the Cleveland market should be well aware of this and help guide you through that process and make sure that you've got the accounts with the right offices and that the bills are going to the right place. And lastly, one of the things that potential investors always want to know is how much should they budget for water and sewer costs for a multifamily, and how much will those actual charges turn out to be. And I can say from experience that it's so incredibly all over the map. It's hard to say budget this certain amount, because you may have tenants that use a ton of water. They may use 2, 3, 4 times what sort of the normal case is. And you also may have tenants that use very, very little. It just really depends on their habits, how many guests they have, sort of how long of a shower they take, how often they do laundry. All sorts of things come into the mix, and it's really tough to give sort of a number to expect. If in the long run, I find that somewhere between $75 and maybe $85 per month per unit is what should be budgeted for water and sewer. But there is an extremely high standard deviation. So, which is to say there's a huge range, right? So tenants in some cases might be just inclined to conserve and take very short showers and shut off the water while they're brushing their teeth. And other tenants are on the opposite end of the spectrum and take 2 or 3 showers a day that are really long and are constantly doing laundry. So it's just all over the map. Just keep in mind that $75 to $85 range per unit for a multifamily property is probably a safe assumption when you're coming into it totally from scratch. Obviously, as you get experience investing in the Cleveland market, you'll probably adjust those numbers based on your own experience. And that's really about it in terms of what investors or potential investors need to know about how utility accounts work with Cleveland real estate. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. If so, please click that like button down below, share the video with a friend, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. It would be greatly appreciated. Until next time, this is Rob on the Cleveland Investor Primer channel, and thanks so much for watching.